Live from Fort Defiance on Capitol Hill. It is Monday, the 30th of March, the year of our Lord 2020. This is War Room Pandemic, live on the John Fredericks Radio Network on americasvoice.news, the streaming platform for the Trump Revolution, now on Dish 219, also Newsmax TV, and FM 99.1 and 103.9 in Chicago. Also, Nexus IRS throughout the known world, and later in the day, subtitled in Mandarin as we blow through the firewall to get to all the noble, hardworking, decent folks in China so they can hear the truth about this pandemic. Remember, on the pandemic, War Room Pandemic, we look at the pandemic, the economic crisis, the financial crisis, the geopolitics, both in the Persian Gulf and with China, the CCP, and the politics of it all. It's 5 vectors that we look at every day on the show. That's why we're not just the granddaddy of them all, the oldest, we're also the best. And the reason we're the best, it's one-stop shop. As the USNS Comfort, a 1,000-bed Navy hospital ship, comes up the Hudson River right now to more on the west side. I think it's Pier 90, Jack Maxey?
Pier 91, 11 a.m. arrival.
And they dredged that over the weekend, so that I think another 4 feet, so we'd get the Comfort in there. They have converted the Javits Center, the Army Corps of Engineers, to a 1,000-bed hospital, field hospital, and they're building field hospitals in Central Park. Quite a march we have gone through. But as T.S. Eliot says, April is the cruelest month, and that is all before us. President of the United States really did some deep thinking this weekend. We've got Raheem Kassam, Jason Miller, Jack Maxey here in the War Room. Let's go right to it because a fundamental, massive change yesterday over the weekend by the President of the United States. A very different Donald J. Trump, I think, really assumed his wartime president role over the weekend and really coming to grips with this. Let's go. There's some terrific cuts over the weekend of the characters in this drama actually stepping onto the stage and telling the people what they think.
I would take it. Just to say one thing also about what Tony had mentioned. So I grew up in Queens, New York, and right next to a place called Elmhurst, Queens. And they have a hospital that's a very good hospital, Elmhurst Hospital, right? I've known it. I've known where it is. I can tell you the color on the outside, the size of the windows. I mean, I know it very well, right? I was near my community where I lived. And I've been watching that for the last week on television. Body bags all over in hallways. I've been watching them bring in trailer trucks, freezer trucks. They're freezer trucks because they can't handle the bodies. There's so many of them.
I want to break this down for you, the next part of this. And this is President Trump. And think about it. People, when he came down that escalator that day in June of 2016, People laughed at him. At that time, you were on the Cruz campaign. Ted Cruz is one of the standard bearers for the conservative movement in this country for the longest time, and really the titular head of the Tea Party. Nobody, the mainstream media would never think that a New York City guy could ever connect with working class people throughout the country. And I think what people don't understand is that he's a guy from Queens. Right at the end of the day, he's become a multi-billionaire. You know, he's got these shows and all the beauty pageants and living at the, he owns golf courses that are in the Open Rota over in England in the Royal and Ancient. He's it's the top of his game ever. But the basics of it, he is a guy that came from Queens, and although his father is very wealthy, he raised him in a very middle class environment. Donald Trump really knows Queens. It was the New York Times story, I think, from that nurse on the apocalyptic day where they lost 13, that then got focused on Elmhurst, which he knows very well. And it was the power of those images on something he knows in his gut. He knows what that is in normal times. And you can see with all the evidence base and all the talk of the projections and all the talk of this, there in real evidence base, he knows what's normal and he knows what's not normal. And he was able to see that. I think that the quote he gave about the kids Friday at the press conference when the guy trying to talk about, hey, how do we stay cooped over the kids? The power of talking about the kids plus that are two of the most powerful, not the most powerful things Trump has said in this entire event.
When Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx presented President Trump with the results from this most recent round of modeling, from this data they put in front of him, and his immediate reaction was that we have to go and do this. And we're going to play clips from both Drs. Birx and Fauci to this point. But President Trump's mind was made up by that point, by the time they put that in front of him. And we've long discussed.
Is that what you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that was the final deciding point for the go forward on the action. But we've long talked about how this will change in the American psyche. And for President Trump, when the images start popping up on the Today Show and we start seeing the ambulances, the hospitals, the gurneys. Trump correctly pointed out the freezer trucks to take the bodies out. And that's exactly what we've seen over this past week in New York.
One thing I want to get into, and this is why it's a war room. We're not just a podcast. We got, over 4.8 million now on the podcast. We're not just a cable TV show and streaming. This is actually a war room. We started this whole concept with impeachment to actually have people up every day getting the information, how you message. Here, we're not partisans. Here, we're trying to get to the truth because we have knowledge of China and knowledge of capital markets and economics, and we've brought in Dr. Hatfield and pulled together, I think, one of the best teams around on the science of it all. But one of the things you keep seeing on mainstream media is evidence-based, science-based. Science have to make decisions. The scientists don't make decisions. They just don't, right? Scientists don't make decisions. Scientists are researchers, and they come up with data and analysis and analytics, and they keep saying, let the scientists make the decisions or let the data make decisions. Data doesn't make decisions. Data and information inform decisions, right? And the more you have, the more data. But remember, you have on the spectrum, you have all the way from information and data all the way to wisdom and judgment, right? It's that spectrum you have to – what President Trump, leaders and policymakers have to take this disparate data and then make decisions off of it. Obviously, it should be evidence-based, but it's evidence-based, but there's another element that's more than just the hard evidence, and that's how you pull together – a decision. President Trump brings all that together. I think the images, in particular, if it had been images of a hospital in Chicago or if it had been images of someplace in Los Angeles, I don't think it would have had the impact. Here, he knows Elmhurst, Queens. He knows what the normal life is of Elmhurst, Queens. He knows that hospital. The biggest tell, the clarifying detail, I know the color of it, right? I know that is a very deep level saying, hey, I know this very well. Now, that image and those things helped inform, I think, his understanding of what the math directionally. The other thing, if you watch the show often enough, you understand one of the things we're arguing about and you're going to hear our voice in here in this decision later about one of the ways we think just to frame it, to think about it, is in New York. And we have said this from the beginning. One of the not dangers, but one of the problems I think we have is we've had Bernie Kerik and Mayor Giuliani, America's mayor, talk about 9/11 and how Pataki and Giuliani worked together. Now, they were in the same political party. That helped. De Blasio and Cuomo are in the same political party, and they clearly have two different sets of numbers they're working off of. One is to have a peak sometime in mid-May, maybe later. The other is peaking on, it looks like, between the 15th and the 21st. That set of numbers for Cuomo is very much, I think, close to what Dr. Birx and Fauci are working on. So it seems to me the White House, you have you have the support function of the federal government that has a set of numbers. You have the management function of the state, which is Governor Cuomo. Then you have the execution, the deck plates, which is the mayor. There's close coordination and agreement on the assumptions of this math. One of the best things going to happen is tomorrow. The president has said, when they were originally going to make the decision, is that he is going to lay out the models. I think some of the analytics, and we'll all get to look at that. There's a tremendous interview in the New Yorker, which I want to get to later, about the libertarian Richard Epstein from Hoover, who I think it looks like now informs some of the decision-making or some of the people around the president. And we've got Dave Ramaswamy looking at this right now. I mean, hey, honestly, and look at this interview in his first article, nothing could be farther from if that was guiding the White House, you see how they got off track. I mean, this guy said there's going to be 500 deaths. I mean, there's 4x of that already. So let's go some of these other cuts where we got time to get these.
Yeah, and I want to just make one point here also. And this is one of the things that frustrated me, and you can see President Trump bringing some of this up this morning when he's talking about Pelosi. Imagine if the National Press Corps had been focusing on China and Wuhan all in late December and through January, rather than focusing on impeachment. I mean, this country was obsessed with impeachment into early mid-February. It was the only thing that folks wanted to talk about. That was it.
We lost 6 weeks. In fact, the impeachment show, we started to shift over to we actually took a whole hour of it in the third or fourth week of January, but we were talking about it in mid-January. I was doing individual broadcasts, but we were doing it. If Pelosi, and this shows you what a waste of time that was. It shows you what how that comes from almost a decadent type of society where you think you just have that away, that time and that focus where you have now we're a supplicant. We're a supplicant to China to get our mask and to get our equipment. We're going to have Dr. Gortler on later from the FDA. He's going to come on, Dr. Winter from St. John's in L.A. He's going to talk to us about ventilators. He's going to talk to us about the ICU. He's going to talk about all the gating events, which we've been talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks. Nancy Pelosi and these Democrats just assume that, hey, everything, they've got the luxury of pursuing something that in hindsight is going to look like not just a waste of time, a criminal waste of time.
Let's go to clips from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, who are both making the rounds on TV this morning. Here's Dr. Fauci.
These models that suggest that even with the current guidelines, the death total in the United States could be between 100,000 and 200,000. So why do you think that was so convincing?
Well, it was quite convincing. I mean, the president, as he said multiple times at the press conference yesterday, his first goal is to prevent suffering and death. And we made it very clear to him that if we pulled back on what we were doing and didn't extend them, there would be more avoidable suffering and avoidable death. So it was a pretty clear decision on his part.
And then also here's Dr. Birx then from the Today Show.
Now from the White House recommending that social distancing, what people should be doing, staying home, is expanded now for another month. The initial 15 days would have expired today, I believe. So what led to this change? What's the situation on the ground that requires this?
You know, we get data every day from around the globe, but more importantly from the United States. I think everyone understands now that you can go from 5 to 50 to 500 to 5,000 cases very quickly. We see this in many metropolitan areas. We're very worried about every city in the United States
And so that's where Dr. Birx goes into every city in the United States. And so the sheer numbers being put in front of President Trump from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, and knowing, as we talked about last Friday, as we went through this University of Washington, essentially rolling peak list of all the different states and their timings, this is going to be coming to every single city across the country. It's just a matter of when. Now, some places will have it worse than others. Hopefully we can avoid a lot more New York's, although we are going to we'll talk later on Detroit for another one, which, by the way, Michigan's numbers have passed almost everybody else. I mean, Michigan's going to catch California here just within a matter of a couple days.
New Orleans, look, New York City, we've said, as you know, listen to this, is Wuhan. And New Orleans and Detroit are going to be the Wuhans coming online. Okay, we're going to take a break here and get everything organized. Hashtag War Room Pandemic. And we love your observations, your criticisms, all of that. We need that. More importantly, we need your recommendations for ideas for coverage. We need your recommendation for guests. And particularly, we want your local news. Anything you've got on this that you actually see, any clip you've got, any local paper, anything you think we're missing, a blog site, anything. Hashtag War Room Pandemic. Going to return Raheem Kassam, Jack Maxey, Jason Miller, Stephen K. Bannon. Episode 85, live from Fort Defiance on a quiet Capitol Hill in a very quiet nation's capital. We're going to return in one moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
The virus is a demon, and we cannot allow this demon to hide. And now President Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States, is out on a crash the demon, crash the virus. You know you're at war when you have a 1,000-bed naval hospital floating up the Hudson River that's now going to pour more right north of the Intrepid, one of the great aircraft carriers in American history. USNS Comfort will be there at 11 o'clock today, come ashore. President Trump was there the other day. That's kind of we'll get to this in a few minutes, Jason, but he actually talked about quarantining New York City, which we've been big advocates of. You got to quarantine New York, you got to quarantine New Orleans, you got to quarantine Detroit. I tell you who agrees with the quarantining. I've got one of the most conservative governors in the country, Ron DeSantis, agrees with us about quarantining New Orleans because he's got state troopers down on the border of Alabama and Florida checking if you got a Louisiana license plate. And the progressive left governor of Rhode Island, who signed an executive order to call out the National Guard to go down to Newport, where all the swells from New York's got their summer places, and started knocking on doors and saying, "Hey, we just want to make sure you're self-quarantined." And she reversed that. But you've got both governors on the right and the left that are taking pretty dramatic action. Building field hospitals in Central Park today. They've taken the Javits Center and turned it over to a 1,000-bed hospital. Jack, I think over the weekend it was McCormick Center in Chicago. Chicago hasn't been getting a lot of focus here, but Chicago's another one that's coming online right after Detroit and right after New Orleans. So when you turn in the McCormick Center, which is where all the auto shows and all the big trade shows are done in Chicago, when they're turning that into a field hospital, it's time to get real. That's what President Trump saw at Elmhurst Hospital. Saw those body bags. You haven't seen I think we've got it up on the site. If you haven't seen the clips of putting those body bags into the refrigerated trucks, you ought to take a look at that. Let's go to the decision President Trump made and how he made it.
Experts who in this country are the best in the world. They demonstrate that the mitigation measures we are putting in place may significantly reduce the number of new infections and ultimately the number of fatalities. I want the American people to know that your selfless, inspiring, and valiant efforts are saving countless lives. You are making the difference. The modeling estimates that the peak in death rate is likely to hit in 2 weeks. So, I'll say it again. The peak, the highest point of death rates, remember this, is likely to hit in 2 weeks. Nothing would be worse than declaring victory before the victory is won. That would be the greatest loss of all. Therefore, the next 2 weeks and during this period, it's very important that everyone strongly follow the guidelines, have to follow the guidelines that our great Vice President holds up a lot. He's holding that up a lot. He believes in it so strongly. The better you do, the faster this whole nightmare will end. Therefore, we will be extending our guidelines to April 30th.
That hit like a bomb. I don't think anybody anticipated he was going to do that. Although I could tell when he went to Marine One and talked about a quarantine, and Cuomo said, well, this will lead to a civil war. When he talked about a quarantine, to me, you see directionally, there was no more unlocking. There's no more looking at everybody wants to unlock. Everybody wants, even the people on the progressive left, I haven't heard anybody wants to shut down the economy. Everybody wants to go back to work. Everybody realizes it's ravaging the economy. President Trump was aspirational and saying, hey, I want it by Easter. I want to get out of this as fast as possible. But you could tell those images in the analysis about New York drove him to think this thing through and to even say, hey, I don't know why we're not quarantining New York, and then clearly came. And I was kind of surprised by the mainstream media. It was like so taken back. To me, directionally, you could see where he was going.
Well, also, it was a little bit of a sleepy press conference up until that point. In fact, I remember one of the things I always take notes during these things or tweet out or combination thereof. And I wrote down, oh, wow, he's going to go and change the tax laws to make it so you can exempt, if you're a contractor or a small business owner, you can exempt meals and entertainment and such. I was like, oh, okay, this is great. I can take Raheem out to Morton's again. I'm back in business. And so I remember
you got to 6 feet from each other.
Right, exactly. So I remember jotting this down, and then boom, he drops this, which again, we had all thought, because he even said day before yesterday that it'd probably be Tuesday when an announcement would come, and nobody saw this coming. And for him to go out there and definitively say we're dropping this 30-day hammer, I thought was the perfect move. And it look, you can see by the way that the media covered it, with the exception of CNN, everyone played it straight up. And even this morning, there's a lot more of a somber tone. A lot of the snark was gone from the television coverage. The news stories were playing it straight up. Everybody got it.
Even the markets overnight.
By the way, does CNN think that we can't see that Jeremy Diamond gets blown up in the Rose Garden for asking a silly question where he curtails a quote from the president, right? And then their whole focus for the next couple of hours is futures are tanking and all this stuff. It's the only network
which was
out there.
Which was nonsense.
Which is not the case.
Also, CNN, and look, I don't want to get into the whole media criticism because that thing's a pass. However, I think this is important. CNN, they have to go 24/7 on both the quarantine and his 30-day lockdown, which are fundamental shifts in focus of what's going to happen to the country, right? And how we're going to attack this and try to break the back of this virus. What is seeing it from Don Lemon all the whole night? Trump backs down. Trump backs down on quarantine. Trump backs down on unlocking thing. He didn't back down. It's the exact opposite. He's actually, you talk about evidence-based, you talk about database. He's thinking this thing through. It was aspirational to unlock it, right? He's thinking this through. And who's the outside of the guys here in the war room? The president's the first senior official that said quarantine. I mean, it put Cuomo back on his back foot. And we may not go to a technical quarantine, but directionally, it's going to get a lot tougher. And I happen to think that we're going to get a lot tougher in this next 30 days. If you're going to break it, let's break it. If you're going to go, let's not flatten the curve. Let's crush the curve. You want to have this normally NPR doesn't say a lot of good things about us, do they? They're pretty even. I should say they're pretty.
Yeah, I got to say that Tamara Keith, NPR, fantastic reporter. Franco Ordonez, who sometimes I've rumbled with a little bit in the past, but usually very solid.
They're solid.
They're solid, and they fact check and they go through their details quite a bit. The other thing too is they listen. They pay attention. They seem to know everything that's going on at all times. I want to play about a 90-second clip that ran nationally on NPR this morning. You might recognize some of the sounds.
Was also hearing from political allies who feared it would be a terrible mistake.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Steve Bannon, who was a top White House advisor before his ouster in 2017, and Jason Miller, a 2016 campaign aide, used their podcast to push for a 30-day national lockdown. They call 30 Days to Save America.
I want to open America back to business.
Exactly. We want to open America. Right. 100%.
Let me tell you my fear. My fear is that if we take this from a piecemeal fashion, that 2 months from now, 3 months from now, 4 months from now, we're still doing the whack-a-mole game as far as not sure how long we're going to have this lockdown and have the economy in jitters.
The pitch: you can't fix the economy until you fix the virus. Numerous recent polls show an overwhelming majority of Americans understand that and support continued social distancing. Reached after Trump's press conference last night, Miller was thrilled.
I think there's a collective sigh of relief and appreciation for the decision that was made tonight.
So what moved Trump to make this decision? Miller says he responds to numbers.
His decision ultimately is going to be made by whoever best makes the case. And it's very clear that Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, and the rest of the coronavirus task force put a very compelling presentation in front of him that required the strongest course of action, as we've seen.
As President Trump publicly wavered on the mitigation measure.
So that was Tamara Keith this morning in Morning Edition on NPR. Very much worth a listen to her full interview and package.
You bring up something. By the way, I just got a lesson there in stepping over someone's lines. Hey, just saying. No, if you're following along at home, President Trump, and this is a very important thing of subtext, when you're in there, he wants to hear different opinions. He's not a guy. There's this thing about he just has certain ideologues. It's the exact opposite. You've got to come in there armed for combat, and you've got to make your case, and you have to have facts to back up your case. Clearly, if you look at what Fauci and these guys have done, and we'll get to see tomorrow, versus at least what this Epstein guy appears to be from Hoover, right, which is very uninformed, right, it's
extraordinary.
Extraordinary. If that was the thinking, and that was based, some of these TV shows and some of that, and some of the libertarians around him, and I'm not picking on the libertarians, but
I will.
Epstein goes out of his way to say he's a libertarian. You see that the weight of the numbers and the analytics won.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I remember, Steve, there was during the transition team, I remember there was a cabinet decision, or at least President Trump was narrowing down a list of cabinet possibilities. And I remember at one point the team was a little bit split on a certain direction. He said, okay, let's go around the room. And everyone in the room had essentially their one or two of their case. And he went around and Steve said something and Ryan said something and I said something and Kellyanne and Hope and Stephen Miller and everyone went around the room. If you're in the room with President Trump, you're expected to have a formed opinion that you can back up, that you can debate, because what he wants to get, it's these data points from a number of different places. And he wants to see how they sound and how people make the compelling case.
Well, plus other people will take your head off. I mean, you got to come in and be able to back it up, because it's not shy of somebody saying, hey, I don't believe any of that. You're wrong here. Bang, bang, bang. This is why you're wrong, right? And he's watching that the entire time, right, if you can back it up.
By the way, just some quick breaking news. The USNS Comfort has arrived in New York City. As the pictures came in on CNN, they cut to an advert for anti-wrinkle cream. That's CNN.
You're on your CNN. Raheem Kassam wants to challenge Jeff Zucker to arm wrestling contest. Okay, war and pandemic. We're going to return to Fort Defiance in just a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Nothing is inevitable, and through human action and humans, we will get through this. If you got to go through hell, go through it as fast and as quick and as hard as possible. Welcome back to War Room Pandemic, episode 85, now with over 4.8 million downloads, plus ubiquitous everywhere, from Dish Channel 219 to Newsmax to the John Fredericks Radio Network, and our producing partners at John Fredericks, and particularly the team in Colorado at America's Voice. Solid folks out there. Great network. The streaming voice of the Trump revolution. Now that we're not doing rallies, I guess the press conferences and War Room Pandemic is the highlight of the day. There are a lot of great shows, a lot of great folks. Super deplorable. If you want to get the ether of the thing, it's America's Voice. Okay, I'm going to go back to this decision. We know that, remember, we have to bridge this. There's got to be, and this is why this week we're going to get into a lot of details about actually how you get cash, particularly these small companies, how you get access to that. We'll have Alfredo Ortiz, Steve Cortez, others during the week on about how you actually get access. You have to. That's the whole thing. Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve was on with Savannah Guthrie last Monday, a week ago. In fact, I think this is the first non-Black Monday we've had in all of March because of the president's decision, because it gives clarity. It gives a focus. It gives us the other side of the chasm. Hey, may it take a little longer? Maybe you might have to take more dramatic actions now. You probably do. We strongly recommend you do. Let's get this thing crashed. But you have to get through. You can't eviscerate the American economy. The president's a businessman and clearly wants to open up. So anything else I want to make sure that we get the informed opinion of the War Room on what do you think of the decision?
I just want to point out, that the market isn't tanking when CNN doesn't have the little box in the corner with the little graph.
You're good.
Right?
You're good, because when it's down, it's always up there.
Yeah, that's right. You can rest assured. You turn on CNN and the graph's not up there, market's doing okay. Guys,
can we book you on Don Lemon tonight? I think you'd be a good counter voice.
I take my yellow pad.
I'd like to make a comment about the president's decision. I think that number one, he's following his scientists, which I think is smart. Number two, I don't really think he had a choice. I mean, you can't ask for $2.2 trillion as a bridging event and then have the bridge be 2 weeks long. I think that he was caught up in the necessity.
Well, you weren't going to be able to
unlock,
but you weren't going to be able to unlock the economy all at once. Egan said they had this thing of county by county. Remember, they're going to triage counties and then they're going to do quadrants. So I don't know if I don't think it's the economic package put him into a corner.
But let's say after 30 days and they go to a modified lockdown and we find out that, okay, Ames, Iowa is locked down and Des Moines is not. Doesn't that sort of contradict the shutdown of the whole country for 30 days if we then go to a patchwork version afterwards? I think, that's sort of my fear, that it looks like too much too early or not enough.
You mean to
later.
unlock the country?
Well, like, would we have to lock down the country for another month if secondary cities are now peaking?
Here's the point. It's incrementalism versus hard decision-making. Incrementalism always takes you to the wrong place. That's where the theory of sunk costs. You can't worry about your sunk costs. One of the hardest things at business school they teach you is to think from now to present, to bring it back to right now. If you start thinking about sunk costs, it's always incrementalism. If you go back and look at political campaigns, if you look at campaigns of war or business strategies, people that fall into the trap of incrementalism always turn out to fail, right? Because you're always making that one incremental change and not actually thinking about the thing itself. That's what. Look, this is a bold, tough move, and we are far away from getting through this thing. We don't know what the future holds. We can only kind of estimate in the fog of war. That's why it is war, in the fog of war. That's why here we try to look at the pandemic and add on. You can't understand what's going on unless you add on the economics of what's happened, and you can't understand that unless you add on the financial crisis we got on a global basis. And you can't understand that unless you also understand the geopolitics. The president today finally, we don't have time for it in today's show, we're going to get tomorrow, finally threw down on the Russians and the Saudis to a degree. The Saudis have, as an active choice, our allies who we've protected for decades and decades and decades, and we would have not brought down the Soviet Union if they were not our allies and pumped like crazy in the 80s. However, they have actively, a huge part of this breaking of OPEC was to destroy the fracking industry in the United States, in Texas, in Pennsylvania, and up in the northern plains. That's obvious. And the president today finally said that geopolitical and then the political, those five vectors is the only way you can understand. And we're not saying we're geniuses. We're just trying to say, hey, you have to have experts and talk about each part of it each day, right? Today we got Gortler and Dr. Gortler and Dr. Winters. I want to talk about in Michigan because this is what I don't understand. Jump in.
Just a real quick thing. I want to make sure that we're not missing a really big detail here. When we're talking about the shutdown, obviously I've been a big fan of this, saying the 30 days to save America, and the whole team here has been saying 30 days to save America. This is a great play. I want to make sure people realize the significance of the market being up this morning, despite the adverse environment going on with oil, because here's what the market's been given. I want to make sure we're not bearing this lead here. It's not so much about the 30-day shutdown as it is the certainty, and it is the light at the end of the tunnel. Markets now know, businesses now know, on a business-by-business basis, we're going to be in this for at least another 30 days and potentially into June. People can now start building their business model around it. They can start making the decisions. They know what the unemployment benefits look like. They know what the small business loan landscape looks like. People can now start planning. Really good write-up in Axios AM this morning about businesses that are adapting. That if you don't go digital, you're going to be dead if you haven't found a way to adapt. You see the companies that are starting to spike this morning. Sanofi Aventis, great French drug maker. You look at Lazy Boy. Everyone's back hanging out with their families. They realize, man, my couch sucks. I got to get a new couch. Lazy Boy is up today because they're all the things that are shifting around. We've talked about our mutual friend who's the CEO of Rex Homes and the kind of different innovative technologies that are out there. This, as much as it is about the tough, definitive action to shut down the country, to smash the curve, it's also giving people hope and some certainty for what the path forward looks like. And I think that's critical so people can wrap their heads around it.
This comes back to what we said last night on the WABC special is, CNN was saying the Dow futures plunging on the back of all this. It was down, 200? And what did I say last night? I said, that's an endorsement. You think about this. And now look at where we are this morning. We're up 350 points this morning, right? It's an endorsement of firm action. It's an endorsement of a concrete date that we can all work towards.
And not saying it's going to be ended that date, but you take hard. Now, let's talk about the hard actions. Number one, I believe, and this is why we do, this pandemic is global. You cannot understand it unless you understand the global nature of it. President Trump, the boldest action he took was stop the flights from China, then stop the flights from Europe when Europe became the new China. Strongly recommend that Fauci and these guys get around and start talking today. I think all flights from all over the world ought to be shut down. For 30 days, we can do anything. And all we're doing is inviting additional virus to come in. I also believe, and I think Michigan's a perfect example of, because I'm not so sure the governor there's totally on top of things, right? Is that you shut down, I think you ought to shut down domestic flights. If you're going to do this for 30 days, go hard. try to isolate these areas that are now incubators for this and try to shut them down. Jack, you have a much better feel for Michigan.
Well, one thing that was really interesting, remember last week we had that friend of ours from Wisconsin, rural guy, said he's ready to do whatever the country needs, but he just couldn't get his arms around all the flights coming into Milwaukee from New York. And it's kind of interesting. There are now 480 cases in Milwaukee County, and I think when he made that call, I think there were like 12. So that is something that I think we need to deal with. Detroit is having a really hard time. They have not been entirely overwhelmed yet, but the city has lots of comorbidities, high asthma, high diabetes, high obesity, high heart disease. So they're going to have a really tough time. There was an interesting story in the Detroit press today about a woman who had diabetes. She was treated. She got out after 9 days, but she said, listen, man, nobody should take this thing sitting down. It was a really tough thing. She said only what got her through. And even the doctors say it's going to be probably a month or two before she fully recovers because of just the stress on her lungs. So, these things are...
Why did the governor... Here's the thing. Governor Cuomo is coming at this with every tool in the toolbox, right? He's not for quarantine, but he's coming at this for every tool in the toolbox. I don't understand. Why is the governor of Michigan inserting herself here with the thing of the anti-malaria drug? Particularly, didn't the FDA last night give at least... They
gave approval for it, yes.
Some temporary approval to kind of use, interim approval, right?
Right. And now... My understanding.
So what does that mean?
I think that she made that decision, made that call, really from a partisan perspective, because I've talked to people who know things about this, and apparently no governor has the right to dictate what doctors prescribe and what they don't prescribe. This is covered by the FDA, the state licensing boards.
Well, the state licensing board report to her?
I don't believe so. I believe she doesn't have the right to deny somebody a license who passes the test, so no.
So what happened? Give us the update. What's actually going on in Michigan now? Can people actually get access to this drug? What's the status of the drug this morning with the FDA? With what the FDA said.
Well, the FDA has approved its use for compassionate use during this thing, and for clinical trials inside hospital, they recommend it's for people who are actually hospitalized and doing poorly. But what's very fascinating about this hydroxychloroquine program, you're now seeing various nation states around the world publish guidelines for its use. For example, India published a fascinating piece yesterday, and they are saying that they should use the hydroxychloroquine as a prophylactic for the healthcare workers, which would be a real game changer.
Smart.
And it was fascinating.
At the same time, they're not shipping any over here.
There's some new information out of China from the central Wuhan hospital. Apparently, they had several hundred patients who were suffering from lupus. So, or several hundred patients of the Department of Dermatology who had lupus and were on a hydroxychloroquine regimen. Now, in a city where they had plenty of infection, not a single one of their lupus patients got the coronavirus. So that is, anecdotal evidence that there is a prophylactic use for this.
Talk to me about France. It's very confusing. The small studies in France showed that this had high efficacy. But what's the nation of France doing? I heard that they've banned it. Is that correct?
This is a little bit of a misnomer. The equivalent of the French FDA last fall decided to pull about a half a dozen common drugs from sitting on the shelves and allowing you to just pick it up and go to the register. Plaquenil was one of those drugs.
It was over the counter. It was over the counter in France.
It used to be over the counter. It had nothing to do with this current virus for them banning the over-the-counter use. It was simply a bureaucratic decision.
But my point is, if it was over-the-counter and approved, and France has got a pretty tough FDA, it must have been, okay.
Well,
right?
It's considered a pretty benign product. I mean, there is a little difference
for
between
malaria.
Hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. The chloroquine has actually passed its usage for an anti-malarial. It's just become resistant. But the hydroxychloroquine is still used as an anti-malarial. And the difference between the drugs is that the chloroquine alone is a little bit more toxic. You have more liver problems. You can have more eye problems. You can get some hearing loss for long-term use, whereas the hydroxychloroquine is much more benign in terms of its impact on the body.
Okay, hashtag War Room Pandemic. We'd like to be able to pull some of the best if we've got any observations in the next segment, if they can do it. You got Jason Miller, the communication strategist for the 16 campaign and also for the interim, for the transition. Raheem Kassam, who was the renowned leader of the Brexit movement with Nigel Farage. Jack Maxey runs the engine room of the War Room with Greg Mann. Stephen K. Bannon will return in just a second.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
A nation capital steeled for war, and the President of the United States has just gone to war with a virus. And for 30 days, the United States of America will be in some form of lockdown or stand down. Never happened before in the history of this country and really the history of this continent. We are known as people that like to get things done. I think President Trump is not being a lawyer, being a businessman. We refer to it, Jason, always as Trump time, and that means he wanted it done yesterday. Raheem, you've got a folks that get things done in this war. The folks going across the beach at Normandy are the doctors and nurses. We've said this from the beginning. It's not ventilators. It's not PPE. It's not beds or ICU units. It's all part of that, but the central thing is the human beings, the human agency of these heroes, which are the doctors and nurses.
Yeah, this is something that's been bearing on my mind for the last week or so, and maybe a little bit more since I first went to my hospital and saw my doctor, and she told me, that I was her first test when these things were first starting, and I saw everyone around, and I've been following the statistics quite closely. Out of Spain, as we know, 25 of their workers infected. The new statistics coming out of the United Kingdom this morning, 1 in 4 National Health Service doctors either sick or in quarantine. And I started to look this morning of, when potentially could the nation, could the president pay deference to all these healthcare workers on the front lines? And it turns out, Steve, that today is National Doctors' Day. In the United States of America, I think it would be the perfect day to be very appreciative for what these people do, for how they expose themselves and how they put themselves on the front line and in the line of fire for the rest of us. So it's National Doctors' Day today. And I hope that the administration can. It's already been done. Remember, the National Health Service in the UK, they had a minute-long applause for the NHS the other night, last Friday, where everyone around the nation was applauding at 8 p.m. I think it would be such a great thing to do. I understand you have different time zones in this country, but I think it would be such a great thing to do all around the nation today.
I think it's part of also what President Trump was trying to get to, and maybe didn't say in the most articulate way, and they got some blowback. But I think when he's saying appreciation, what he's really talking about, I think, is the frontline people, the emergency responders, the police. We have high infection rates. It looks like in New Orleans, you've got the high. These numbers are astronomical. Remember, the casualties start to exacerbate when the doctor nurses teams become infected. Dr. Lee, the great hero, martyr of this so far, is this amazing young doctor in China that in the WeChat with the guys he graduated from medical school with in December on WeChat, which is the way they communicate in China, started talking about a SARS outbreak. And he started to talk about coming to the hospital and how they had to start handling it. The authorities picked it up. They tortured him. They intimidated his family, which they still intimidate. They intimidated his family, forced him to sign a document that said you're a rumor monger. And remember, rumor monger under the Chinese Communist Party means your social credit score drops. Your kids are not going to get into school. You're going to live like a pauper. It is horrible. I mean, they basically ostracized this guy. Later, they had to admit when the world came that it was wrong. He volunteered, and this is the spirit I think he represents or is emblematic of the spirits of the doctors and nurses throughout the world. He volunteered to go back to his hospital, understanding in doing that it was probably a death sentence. And he died 2 weeks later. And the thing that was most haunting, his last interview was with the New York Times. And he said, or last English interview was with the New York Times, he said, I got careless. He said, it's on me. He said, I had a patient who was asymptomatic. He went in to do an operation on a woman who was asymptomatic. He caught it. He took the protective gear off. It wasn't as hot. Yeah, didn't have the standards. And he admitted. He says, "I made a mistake." This guy is just a global hero. I mean, it's a very moving story. His family had young children. 41 years old. I don't want to hear you catch it if you're in your 90s. 41 years old. A true global hero.
Yeah, I mean, he was doing an operation on a cataract. I mean, think about that. That's not exactly creating a lot of fluids or anything like that, but real hero. And I think one thing that we have to understand as this thing goes forward, it's all of the emergency personnel who are really going to be at risk. New Jersey now has 700 police officers who have tested positive. As of yesterday, the city of New York had over 600. They expected that to go up a lot today. And Nassau County has 21. Chicago has 3 who've been hospitalized. So this is a serious issue for the frontline guys. And I'd love to hear from any of our listeners, if anybody is using hydroxychloroquine prophylactically in the country.
And also anything about Doctors and Nurses Day. It's Doctors Day, Appreciation Day, #pandemic. I want to say something. We're going to have 2 doctors on. Dr. Winters from St. John's Hospital, the complex out in Los Angeles, Santa Monica, one of the great institutions in the country. And also Dr. Gortler, who's formerly with the FDA. Dr. Winters was the guy who talked to us about the coming hurricane. He's going to get us up there. He's the first doctor we had on months ago talk about this gating event at the ICU units. Want to talk to him about nationwide how it stands. Dr. Gortler was one of the first people to warn us, along with Rosemary Gibson, about being dependent upon China to make everything. You got these planes coming in now. We're like a supplicant, right? We can never get in the situation again. In fact, I don't know if we're going to have a great awakening. I don't know if this is going to lead to a spiritual rejuvenation of the country, but I can tell you one thing I do know. People are going to appreciate the small things that makes American life so different. Right now, when you're away from it, not just the sports and everything like that, but just this should be a rejuvenation, regardless of political party, regardless of partisanship, regardless of anything, to understand, to appreciate just the small things. Does it lead to a spiritual awakening, a great awakening? Who knows? But I think it's going to lead to a fundamental understanding of what's important and what's not.
Yeah, and President Trump referenced that yesterday in his press conference. He talked about getting back in touch with families, getting back in touch with your loved ones, and even people who maybe you don't see that often, reaching out and talk to them via Facebook or on the phone or different things. There was a lot of empathy in President Trump's remarks last night. Steve,
he was moved. That was a different over the weekend, from the time he gave that comment at the end of the press conference about kids. I think you saw a different guy. I think you saw someone much more gravitas, much more. Now, look, it's still, I love him. He's still President Trump. We're going to next hour. He's still coming after Nancy Pelosi.
Lightning bolts.
He's still going to get lightning bolts from Olympus. But I think that's the signal in the noise. That's the noise. The signal is very powerful that we are at war. He is a wartime president. Okay.
And a lot of good commentary, #WarRoomPandemic, a lot of good things. So go on there and put your comments. A lot of good feedback to Jack's comments about hydroxychloroquine. People are offering up their thoughts. So one person said he was in the military, took it for malaria. And big question for you, Steve, from one of our listeners in San Diego. When you went into the White House, what was the very first thing you wrote on your whiteboard? After the break, we want to come back to that.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back with episode 86 of War Room Pandemic. See you in a second.